So for those of you just joining us, welcome to the webinar, Revolutionize Instruction for Students with Disabilities, HighLeverage Practices. I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters. Deborah Ziegler, Ed.D., is the Council for Exceptional Children's Director of Policy and Advocacy. James McCleskey, Ph.D., is a professor at the University of Florida and is part of the staff at the CEEDAR Center. Paula Lancaster, Ph.D., is a professor and the Director of Teacher Education at Grand Valley State University in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Sarah Drinkwater, Ph.D., is the Assistant Superintendent in the Oregon Department of Education. Now, I'll turn it over to Dr. Ziegler to get our webinar started.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening for those of you who are on the East Coast, and good afternoon for those who are Mid and West Coast. Happy to be here. Let's look at the overview and the agenda for tonight's webinar. We have a lot to cover and share with you, and we want to hear what you have interest in as well. And as Megan said, the chat box will be open. So the overview of tonight will be why develop high leverage practices, what are the high leverage practices, and how are they being used. And we have two very robust examples of practice in the state of Oregon and the state of Michigan. And then finally, what's next, resources and tools that you can use and take back with you tomorrow and use them in your work every day. So the High Leverage Practices was a collaborative process, and it was a partnership between the CEEDAR Center at the University of Florida, which is an OSEP-funded grant, the Council for Exceptional Children, and CEC's Teacher Education Division. We were fortunate to have a variety of partners and expertise in order to develop the high leverage practices. CEC's board commissioned a high leverage practices work group, and our first meeting was in January of 2015. Many of you might remember the extensive CEC member input. We did that through town halls, through focus groups of university professionals, of classroom teachers, of administrators. We also did an online survey, and we received thousands of members who were providing input to us over the course of the development of the high leverage practices. And finally, we after the input, they also went to CEC's Representative Assembly for their input, and the CEC board approved the high leverage practices on July of 2016. You can see here the list of the high leverage practices work group members, university folks from across the nation, as well as some association individuals. It was a very hardworking group who were tasked with developing the practices. I can tell you that we spent hours deliberating words and sentences in order to make sure that we got the practices right, and that they were based on the evidence and the research. I'm going to turn it over to James, and he's going to talk about what is a high leverage practice.
Thank you, Deb, very much, and welcome to everyone. Thank you for participating in the webinar tonight. And as Deb said, I'll start off with what is a high leverage practice. At the most basic level, these are effective instructional, behavioral, assessment, and collaboration practices that teachers use to improve student outcomes. The practices that are identified should be essential to effective teaching and fundamental to supporting student learning. Teacher candidates who learn to use these practices should be well prepared with a foundation for developing other aspects of their practice as they become highly accomplished professionals during the early years of their teaching careers. The bottom line is that these practices should provide a foundation of the most critical skills that beginning teachers can use to improve student outcomes. Explicit instruction that's included on the slide is a good example of such a practice, and I would assume that we all agree that every special ed teacher should be proficient in the use of this practice when they begin their teaching career. Next slide. Next slide, Deb.
It's not advancing for me. Oh, there we go.
There you go. That's good. Okay.
All right, we're on.
A little delayed reaction there. So why identify high leverage practices? We need to identify practices that are fundamental to teaching for exactly the same reason that other professions identify essential practices. All professions, from airline pilots to plumbers, from cosmetologists to physicians, have identified core practices. And anyone who's entering one of these professions must know how to use these practices at a reasonable level of proficiency. A plumber recently installed a faucet for a friend of mine in his kitchen. First thing my friend did when the plumber left, as you might imagine, is to inspect inside the cabinet under the faucet to see if the faucet leaked. And if he's like most of us, he probably checked the cabinet the next morning as well. Now, master plumber would never hire a plumber to independently install a faucet unless he knew without a doubt that the plumber could install a faucet that would not leak with a high level of reliability. Same for airline pilots. They must be able to land a plane in a crosswind before beginning to fly a plane independently, among other things. Otherwise, the outcome could be much more extreme than a leaking faucet. Next slide. There are several other reasons why it's important to develop essential practices for teachers. As I'm sure you all know, there's a research to practice gap. Even experienced teachers do not often use the most effective practices in their classroom. The question is, could improving teacher education improve teacher practice in this regard? I've never talked to a teacher educator who, at least when asked, did not complain that there was too much to cover in their teacher preparation program. I know Megan said there are a lot of teacher educators on today, so if you'll think about this for a second, is this the case for your program? Do you have too much to cover within your program? As I think about it in programs I've been in, we offer information on a range of topics and keep adding critically important information that candidates must know about within their programs. We cover every disability category, including characteristics and identification, child development, history of education, history of special education, federal laws, court cases, parts of the IEP, and obviously I could go on and on as far as all those things are concerned. What results is that we only have time to talk about the most important thing teachers learn during preparation, effective practices, and little to no time to systematically prepare candidates to use these practices as part of their preparation. Next slide. So if this is the case, how do candidates learn to use practices during their preparation program? As many of you know, I'm sure there's quite a bit of research on candidates' views of this, about what practices they learn and how they learn them. And what they tell us is they learn to practice from field experiences and from internship. They view this as the most important part of their preparation. This is where they really learn to teach, we often hear them say. This is also often the component of their program over which teacher educators have the least control. Candidates thus learn practices that their supervising teacher uses and that they deem as important to learn. There's no guarantee that these practices will be learned to a reasonable level of proficiency, nor is there a guarantee that these practices are effective or the ones that we would like a candidate to learn. HLPs allow us to focus on preparing candidates to learn to use the most important practices. Next slide. Now, if we step back a minute and think about this, we are different from other professions where expectations for performance are clear and professionals are systematically trained to use practices to a reasonable level of proficiency. Anders Ericsson is well known for studying professions and the development of expertise. If you're interested in his work, he has a book out called Peak, Secrets from the New Science of Expertise. He says that complex practices across professions are not learned by simply reading about them in a book or listening to someone talk about the practice or watching a video of someone using the practice. Rather, expertise in professions is gained through multiple, well-structured opportunities to practice particular skills in authentic settings with support and feedback. Let me say that again. This is the key. as far as high leverage practice is concerned, because evidence indicates from professional development, a range of other areas of research, but also expertise in a range of professions, that expertise is gained through multiple well-structured opportunities to practice, opportunities to learn, particular skills that are focused on in authentic settings with support and with feedback. Next slide. So, based on extensive research on the development of expertise across professions and research in the area of professional development as well, one of the major barriers to improving the practice of teachers is that we have not identified the most important practices special education teachers should learn to use. CEC and CEEDAR have put a stake in the ground regarding this shortcoming. To improve practice, we must define what we want special education teachers to be able to do to improve student outcomes. Next slide. The intention in developing the HLP is thus to focus the curriculum so that there's time to prepare candidates to use a limited number of critical core practices to a reasonable level of proficiency. Next slide. The HLP writing team used several criteria to identify the HLPs. Of course, of utmost importance, these have to be practices that are effective in improving student outcomes. They also have to be used frequently by teachers. The most essential practices are not those that are used once a semester. We need practices that will be used often and will thus have a substantial impact on student outcomes. We also need to identify practices that teachers will use often, so they'll have a lot of opportunities to learn to use the practice and sustain that use over time. The HLPs also should be broadly applicable across content areas for similar reasons, and they should be fundamental to effective teaching. Next slide. From the perspective of teacher prep programs, these also need to be practices that novices can learn, and we can teach them to use during the course of a teacher preparation program. And they also must be limited in number to make sure that this occurs. I would also add that if high leverage practices are going to be useful for improving teacher practice, these practices have to resonate with you. They have to belong to you, not to CEC or the CEEDAR Center or the HLP writing team or anybody else. They have to belong to the profession, to teacher educators, to special ed teachers, to special ed administrators, principals, general ed teachers, and so forth. You have to look at these practices and react similarly to a master plumber who says to begin practice, a novice plumber must learn to install a faucet that doesn't leak. And if these HLPs are not that clear, if they don't resonate with you, we need to change them and improve them. We need to make sure that we use systematic research and development, as well as the wisdom of practice, to ensure that we have the best possible set of high leverage practices that are the most important practices to improve outcomes for students with disabilities. As we'll all agree, these students and their teachers deserve no less. Next slide. So the goal is to produce a teacher who has a foundation of skills to build on in becoming a highly effective special educator. As these practices were being identified, the HLP writing team continually came back to the idea that all of these practices together should focus on preparing a special education teacher who is a database problem solver, who uses data to improve instruction and behavior. Next slide. CEC and CEEDAR and several other national centers have begun to develop resources to support the use of the high leverage practice, and a lot of support's coming from the U.S. Department of Education to do this. As a first step, the HLP writing team felt that it was important to produce a resource that could provide a rich introduction to the high leverage practices. The book that's pictured in this slide provides a description of the components of each practice, as well as a brief review of research or policy support for each of the practices. The book's available in hard copy from the Council for Exceptional Children, as well as a free PDF download from the CEEDAR Center website, as well as from CEC. Next slide. CEC, the CEEDAR Center, and oops, hang on a minute. I got a glitch now, sorry. Now, CEC is developing a range of resources, including a book that will be out in 2018 from CEC and Routledge that focuses on providing teachers with practical information related to using the HLPs in their classrooms. Next slide. CEC has also developed a website that includes resources related to the HLPs to support this work. The website's just getting developed, but you'll see in the coming months more and more things will be posted on the CEC website related to the use of the HLPs. Another important resource that's under development and supported by the U.S. Department of Education and OSEP, CEC, the CEEDAR Center, Great Teachers and Leaders Center, and several other national centers and groups, is a set of videos that illustrate the use of high-leverage practices across tiers of instruction. This work's being organized by Lynn Holheide from AIR and also affiliated with CEEDAR and the GTL Center. And the videos are being developed by Michael Kennedy and his colleagues. Michael was a member of the High-Leverage Practice writing team. And they should start rolling out these videos soon. All of the videos will be available for free, and they'll be widely distributed. So you should be able to find them within a few months through CEC's website as well as the CEEDAR website. If you can't find them, let me know, and I'll send you a link to them. A final comment about this. This work obviously is complex. It's time-consuming. It requires a lot of resources. We can substantially improve the quality of the work we do in improving teacher preparation if we work together, if we share resources and good ideas. A collaborative approach is something that's been emphasized by CEC, by the Department of Ed and OSEP, the CEEDAR Center, other national centers that have been involved in this work. We hope to continue this collaborative, open access work and hope you'll join us in figuring out how to accomplish this task and improve the quality of teacher preparation and ultimately improve the practice of special education teachers. Next slide. One of the most gratifying things for members of the HLP writing team and those of us at the CEEDAR Center has been that these practices have seemed to resonate with many teacher education faculty. CEEDAR currently works with 20 states providing intensive TA, and many of these states have begun to do very impressive work related to the use of the HLPs as a critical component of the curriculum for teacher preparation. 2 states that are doing a fine job in this regard are here with us tonight. And we're going to hear next from Paula Lancaster about the work that Michigan's doing related to HLPs, and she'll be followed by Sarah Drinkwater, who'll tell us about the HLP work that's going on in Oregon. Paula?
Thank you, Jim. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to be part of this great group and to talk with all of you. I'd like to start with a photo of our lovely downtown Grand Rapids campus because I know that many people are not familiar with Grand Valley State University. We're a regional university serving largely Western Michigan. We have just over 25,000 students and a fairly large college of education. Work on high leverage practices in Michigan involves a few different groups. I want to take just a minute to talk about them. Our institution is part of the Michigan Program Network, and that is a group of 6 teacher preparation programs noted on the slide, and Teaching Works, which is located at the University of Michigan and affiliated with their School of Education. Our network has been together for 3 years, working to both embed high leverage practices into our general education programs and also to move our programs toward, our preparation programs toward a more practice-based approach. So when CEC and CEEDAR began to roll out their initial work, we were very, very excited to extend our efforts into special education. And just as a note, in Michigan, all special education teachers begin by being general education teachers. They get their general education certification, and to that they add special education endorsements. So, being able to work with HLPs in both of these areas has really been exciting for us. And within our CEEDAR project, we had just started our CEEDAR grant in Michigan when the HLPs started to roll out, so that was really perfect timing for us. We have 4 institutions in the Michigan Department of Education that have also been working toward implementing the special education HLPs and largely focused on the context of early literacy instruction when we've been doing that work. And then finally, in our state, we are fortunate to have representatives from all of our preparation programs who are part of MACD, the Michigan Association of Colleges of Education. and they are very aware of the work that's going on in the state and across the country, and are also supportive of HLPs and practice-based approaches, and so are beginning to work on policy toward that end. At any layer, though, in the state, we center our work around the notion that access to skillful teachers is an equity issue. We know that teacher turnover is a problem, particularly in special education, that beginner teachers often report feeling underprepared for their work, and that a higher percentage of beginner teachers work in schools characterized as low income or high minority. Yet we also know that all children, regardless of where they live, their parents' income level, or their learning characteristics, deserve a well-prepared teacher. And we believe that this work moves us toward better preparation. And that's what keeps us focused on practice. Additionally, in education, as many of you know, we have tended to talk about teaching and instruction in vague generalities. I've had many conversations with school administrators over the years, or cooperating teachers, about beginner teacher preparedness. And oftentimes we're talking about kind of quote unquote classroom management or addressing disruptive behavior. But those terms are really quite vague in general. And so when I'm having conversations with whether they're administrators or cooperating teachers, I'm never quite sure that we're sharing the same meaning or same thoughts about classroom management, for example. But when we're identifying and focusing on HLPs, this allows us to be so much more precise in the way in which we teach about and talk about the work of teaching, so that shared language has really improved our communication. And thanks to CEC, CEEDAR, and the writing team, we do have a clear sense of what the practices are. On our end, we are now focused on mapping the HLPs within our preparation programs and thinking differently about how we teach them and the enactment experiences we provide. We're learning and using different teaching preparation methods and pedagogies, and thinking about materials and assessments we might need for specific practices and even content areas. So over the next few slides, I'm going to talk a little bit more about each one of those points. When we initially considered making HLPs central to our preparation programs, curriculum work seemed like a good place to start. The first step was locating the HLPs in particular courses and thinking about them as potentially developmental. So for example, starting with maybe simpler HLPs and working to more complex, or thinking about how we might bundle some of them together or prioritizing them in particular ways. Ultimately, we want to ensure that all of our candidates would be proficient in a majority of the HLPs. And this requires really careful planning, discussion, and agreement. We also want to ensure that our K-12 partners agree with our priorities and are with us on this journey. So we now have 2 substantial professional learning communities with some of our K-12 partners that are meeting regularly to develop common language and understanding around the practices and how to support beginner teachers in enacting them. And these experiences have been amazing. They've been some of the most productive and fruitful work that we've done in quite some time. So we're excited about that work. But we also realize that ensuring that beginner teachers can enact the practices requires much more than just describing them in courses, as was mentioned earlier. We started getting very specific about how we deconstruct or decompose the practices into smaller teachable components, so that our students can both see the complexity in each of these practices, but also begin to develop their own shared language and understanding about what it means to be, or what it means to get to a level of competent enactment of the practices. We're working also on how we represent these practices for our students. So what do they see by way of our modeling of the practices, and then also the occasional use of video representation. So I'm really excited to see the videos that will be coming out, because sometimes finding those really good representations can be a challenge, or creating your own can be a challenge. We're also creating opportunities for our teacher candidates to enact the practices or specific components of them at different levels. For example, we're creating assignments and opportunities for approximations such as role play and simulations that occur before actual live enactment with children. So we want them to be really well prepared before they get into that classroom setting. One thing I can say that I definitely know now that I didn't know before is that taking a more practice-based focus requires changing the way we teach teaching to beginners. So I think I should say that again. Taking a more practice-based focus requires changing the way we teach teaching to beginners. Another significant part of this work is providing opportunities for teacher preparation faculty, field supervisors, cooperating teachers, to learn a new set of pedagogical practices that includes providing things like very, very specific targeted feedback to our beginners and our teacher candidates, offering opportunities for rehearsals in which candidates can practice components of the HLPs in front of their peers and get immediate in-the-moment feedback. Huddles, which can occur in live small group setups, and then also role plays and simulations, which I mentioned a few moments ago. Learning these new approaches and feeling comfortable using them takes time and commitment, but working on the techniques has given us a sense of cohesion and coherence that we haven't felt in our professional lives in quite some time. I mean, just the discussion in our own departments around some of the practices has been incredibly enlightening. So we're excited to continue that work. Our next heavy lift will include drawing in our colleagues from the content areas into a discussion about shared language and terminology, reaching some agreement on what we mean by competent or ready to teach with regard to the practices, and creating assessment tools so that we can complete reliability checks of our observations of practice. We're also thinking a lot about collecting pre and post video of our teacher candidates so that they have the opportunity to reflect on their growth over time. And I mentioned these pieces of work because we are finding that adopting the HLPs and disseminating information about what they are is one significant part of this whole endeavor, but transforming the manner in which we prepare teachers is another entirely different but equally important part. Frequently, I find myself in conversation with people who represent various parts of the education enterprise. So it could be other faculty here at Grand Valley or across the state, or administrators or teachers, literacy coaches, all of those types of folks. And I have certainly noticed that as we get into conversations about HLPs and the work that goes along with that, we're seeing widespread agreement about the necessity of this direction. And that part has really been fulfilling to hear. What we know too is that on our campus and in our state, we need to keep the conversations going. There are institutions further along than we are, and I'm very grateful for the opportunities we've had to learn from them. I'd go back to what was said earlier about sharing and working together and collaborating. It's so important because we know that this is a really heavy lift, but the potential outcomes for all children and for our profession are so worth the effort. So thank you very much for your time tonight and for the discussion I know that's going to ensue. I'm really, again, grateful for the opportunity. And I'm going to turn the presentation over to Sarah to share the great things happening in Oregon.
Hello, this is Sarah Drinkwater from Oregon, and if I use the words afternoon, it's because of the time change, and I'm here in the afternoon with you. I'm very glad to be able to share some of the unique work that is going on in Oregon, and I used the term uniquely Oregon very specifically because in lots of ways Oregon chooses to do things very uniquely, I should say. So let's go on and learn a little bit more. Oregon joined CEEDAR as a cohort in 2015, so we have been at work for just about 2 years. And we have compacts with a couple of higher education agencies, Portland State University, Western Oregon University, the University of Oregon, Marylhurst, and George Fox University. And through our initial work, we created 2 statewide implementation and practice teams, one that was focusing on teacher practice and one that is focusing on administrator practice. Again, with our first work, we took a look at sort of an overall framework of what we wanted to focus on as a large group. And we wanted to, across some of the teacher preparation programs, align some of the critical preparation standards. We also wanted to infuse education equity and the high leverage practices within teacher preparation, and also want to do some work around clustering clinical practice placements. We're a very diverse state with rural and urban areas, and actually many of our school districts are very small or very, very small and in rural areas. We also wanted to expand our focus on education equity and special education together and collaboratively. So that was the blueprint that Oregon began with in our work in 2015 and early 2016. So let's talk a little bit about our administrative license redesign and trying to focus leadership and clinical practices. One specific action that was taken and work that was developed are through the preliminary admin licenses and some courses that have been approved by our Teacher Practices Commission. And the universities paired up. Portland State University paired with George Fox, and our Confederation of Oregon School Administrators coordinated with University of Oregon to develop 2 modules that are already on the books for fall and winter of 2017-18 in special education for administrators. One of them is focusing on special education for administrators, new administrators, and taking a look at FAPE. What does that mean? How do I make sure that services are being provided for students in my school that I am an administrator of? And the other module focuses on secondary transition and the least restrictive environment. As students are moving through and turning into young adults, ages 18 to 21, what should that secondary transition program look like? What's important about pre-employment skills or post-secondary options that students might have? So it's been wonderful that there's been this collaboration between universities and our administrative organization in Oregon, and that these modules and courses are on the books already for fall and winter of this school year. The teacher implementation and practice team has also worked individually and collaboratively with together. In a later slide, you will see 6 HLPs that were selected from the larger list. They co-created a list of the 6 HLPs that they will focus on in pre-service general and special education teacher preparation programs. And I'm going to go through some specific examples that are occurring right now in some of the universities. Western Oregon University is utilizing a immersion virtual learning environment. Some of you may know about this, and this relates to the use of avatars and technology in developing a classroom environment. James mentioned earlier about novice teachers and the importance of practice. And so the immersion environment allows for virtual learning with the use of avatars, and it is a fabulous and fun opportunity. So Western Oregon is very involved in that and using that type of technology in teacher preparation and practice. In addition, Western Oregon has developed 2 sessions, professional development for their candidate teachers, focusing on 2 of the high leverage practices, specifically explicit instruction and data collection and analysis. And this goes back to some of the information that both Paula and James talked about, with some of the most important skills that we want teachers to learn and what is important for special education teachers. Next, Portland State University has taken a little bit different direction, but still focusing on the high leverage practices. They are embedding 3 particular HLPs within selected coursework that is going across departments. What the CEEDAR work has enabled Portland State University to do is bring together general education and special education faculty, and they are actually creating a faculty group to focus on equity that is across those 2 departments. So when you team together the high leverage practices within selected coursework and the work that is being developed and initiated with the faculty group collaboration with a focus on equity, that is very exciting for Portland State University. Marylhurst is a university that has teacher preparation program in general education. They don't have a special education track, but they have been one of the most energetic and interested partners in our CEEDAR work. And they want to be a part of this work because they know the teachers that they are training will be supporting students with disabilities in their classrooms, and that the high leverage practices are so important that they are just a great team member in the work that we're doing. They have embedded the high leverage practices in their master's programs for general education and are using them in the focus of their field experiences and clinical placements. This is very important work for them, that they support their general ed teacher preparation program and using high leverage practices for teachers who are very skilled to be able to teach a variety of students who just have different learning needs, whatever they might be. Finally, the University of Oregon has identified some of the high leverage practices and content for both special education and general ed, and they are actually going beyond the not original 6, but the 6 that were co-selected. And they would like to be able to, they've identified them and want to use them in one course, so that they're looking at focusing one course in particular to highlight and focus on the high leverage practices. As I mentioned before, they collaborated in creating the secondary transition module for use in their admin licensure program and coursework as well. University of Oregon has a teacher preparation program as well as an admin preparation program. So they're involved in both of our implementation and practice teams, the admin one and the teacher implementation team as well. So the 6 high leverage practices that were identified in our work are listed there on the slide, looking at collaboration with professionals and families. I mentioned the using explicit instruction, using positive and constructive feedback to facilitate a consistent learning environment, so using some of those strategies and a behavior management of the environment. Systematically designing and implementing and evaluating instruction, so looking at that cycle of design, implementation, and evaluation. The 5th one, adapting curricular tasks and materials. So having teachers and pre-service teachers taking a look, what is the learning goal for a particular lesson, and how would they then go about adapting some of the tasks and materials to focus specifically on that goal. And then finally, analyzing instruction and student progress. So with the connection between instruction and the student's progress, and looking at tightening that relationship between instruction and student progress. So some of the things that have been important in our work in Oregon, and I heard it also mentioned by Paula as important in Michigan as well, is that the high leverage practice work has really created a common language across our institutions of higher education, and it's brought them together in collaborative work. It's also been one work that has been infused in both teacher preparation and administrative preparation for more inclusive schools, that there are students with all different kinds of learning needs in our classrooms, and looking at those high leverage practices that are very successful with many different students. The practices we know are universal, and they facilitate a common language no matter what the context of the conversation is among teachers, or the context, the content, or the environment. So it really is a communication facilitation tool as well. So lastly, some of our learnings that I'd like to pass on to those of you who are listening to us today is that if you are thinking about embarking on this type of journey, you would really want to take a look at the governance structures of the different partners that you're thinking about bringing together. The state education agency, the colleges and universities, whether you have a teacher licensure is a part of your Department of Education or not. In Oregon, teacher licensure is a different agency, and so bringing them in, as well as the professional organizations. You also want to take a look at the existing formal and informal relationships that are already in place before you get started, so that assumptions aren't made about things already occurring or not, and you have a better idea of some of those relationships that are already occurring. In addition, knowledge of programs that are already in place so that you can leverage activities and work that is already happening, and then continue to help move that work forward and coordinate it. So thanks again for spending some time with us this afternoon. I was happy to share what has been going on in Oregon.
Wow, this is Deb. You know, Sarah and James and Paula and I have done several of these presentations over the course of the last couple of months to a whole variety of different audiences. And each time we do it, particularly hearing about the examples from Oregon and Michigan, I can see the growth in the practices and the application of the HLPs really taking hold, and it's really very rewarding to see that. And so thank you both for your work to really introduce these to your colleagues, to the field, and begin the implementation and dissemination of them. So let's now move to some resources for you. Where to find the HLPs. So in this slide, you'll see the cover, High Leverage Practices, Special Education. This is the book that talks about the process of developing the high leverage practices, as well as the 22 high leverage practices themselves, and a very extensive research synthesis for each of the 22 high leverage practices. So it is a wealth of resources, and you can find it on CEC's website to purchase if you would want the hard copy book. But we also have downloadable PDFs that are on the CEC website. They're also on the CEEDAR website, and you'll see the HighLeveragesPractices.org website there. So you could download all of the 22 high leverage practices, or we also have PDFs if you're only interested in one of them. And then also the same is true for the research synthesis. So the research synthesis would be great for all of you who are using them in your curriculum in preparing teacher candidates, and so I would highly recommend you take a look at those and integrating them into the work that you're doing. We most recently had an article in Teaching Exceptional Children in the May-June edition of 2017. You might want to take a look at that. Many of the same resources that you might find on the website or in the book are also contained in a short digest in the Teaching Exceptional Children journal. In addition, we're developing a very robust dissemination and implementation plan over the course of the rest of 2017 and well into 2018. We see this as a long journey. And as we move forward, we'll be introducing new resources and materials that we hope will be valuable not only for higher education faculty and the work that they're doing to prepare teacher candidates, but also for teachers themselves once they move into classrooms, and using the HighLeverage practices as good examples of practice that they should be implementing every day in their classrooms. We also see applications for the HighLeverage practices with administrators, building principals, special ed directors who are also wanting to make sure that their special education teachers and general ed teachers are implementing HighLeverage practices in systematic ways. We see applications for general educators as well, and in some of the work that we're doing for the future, we hopefully will be extending much of this work not only in the special ed arena, but also in the general education arena as well. So we've begun sharing the HLPs with external partners and organizations, and just to give you an example of some of these partners, every member of Congress will be receiving a copy of the HighLeverage Practices book, as well as every governor across the nation, every chief state school officer, every director of licensing and credentialing in state departments of education. We'll also be distributing them to associations, the Principals Association, AACTE as an example, many of the disability community organizations, both advocacy groups as well as the families community. We also will be disseminating them to all the OSEP-funded technical assistance and dissemination centers. So we want this to get out into the field far and wide. In addition, we'll be working with many of those external partners and organizations to prepare presentations at their meetings as well as their conferences throughout the next several months. Some upcoming conferences that you might be interested in will include the Teacher Education Division conference that's being held in November in Savannah, Georgia, and they have a rich program developed for those of you who will be attending, and I know many on this call and this webinar will be attending the TED meeting. Mary Brunell, who is the director of the CEEDAR Center, along with Paula and James, will be doing one of the keynote sessions on HighLeverage practices, and then we'll have a session that follows that keynote to do a deep dive into the HighLeverage practices. So we invite you to participate in that meeting. We also will be presenting to the Council of the Chief State School Officers at their upcoming meeting in Dallas, Texas in October, and of course at the CEC convention in February in Tampa, Florida. If you are aware of any particular group that would like to feature the HLPs at your meeting or a meeting that you're familiar with, please let me know and we'll see if we can accommodate that request. You also heard about the HighLeverage Practice instructional videos that are under development right now, and I'm so excited about these because I think Paula might have mentioned this, is that it's sometimes hard to find videos that really allow us to see how these practices are implemented in classrooms with children and with teachers implementing those. So these videos hopefully will answer that need, and They are under development as we speak. We have a team of individuals across a variety of associations and partners who are reviewing them and working with Michael Kennedy, who is leading the development of these videos. We will have an opportunity at the TED conference in November in Savannah to review the first video. We'll be unveiling it in draft form, and we hope that many of you would attend that a session. It'll be Thursday night from 5 to 6:30. We want to hear what you think about the video. We want your feedback. We want your expertise. We want to hear whether what's been developed, it will be helpful as you prepare candidates. So we invite you to participate in that session. There'll be information in the program book, and we will be sending a flyer out to all TED members about this opportunity. We also will be developing HighLeverage Practices podcasts on many of the HighLeverage practices, and those will be part of the larger collection of podcasts that CEC has currently on its website. Mostly on our journal articles from TEC and EC. So we're looking forward to unveiling the podcasts as we move forward in the next year. And then finally, James mentioned this a few minutes ago, HighLeverage Practices for the Inclusive Classroom publication that CEC and Rutledge are co-publishing, and we have a spring of 2018 on that. It's probably a pretty ambitious schedule, but we hope that we'll see that book in the very near future. And this will be a very practical book for teacher candidates, and I think will be very, very useful in the classrooms and also in teacher preparation. So thank you for being with us. I know we provided you a lot of information. We hope that it was useful to you, and we'd like to now turn it back to Megan, and we would be happy to answer questions or hear your comments or input about what we've presented here this afternoon.
Okay, so we'll give you guys a minute to type those questions in the chat box, and we've got a couple that came in during the presentation. So Blake's asking, and Paula, this came in during your part talking about the work in Michigan, the info that's being discussed about new approaches to teaching teachers. Do you have more information on that? And for Sarah and James and Deb, do you guys have anything to add to what Paula mentioned about changing how we teach teachers?
Well, I mean, it's a great question. We are learning, and I think most of our work has been through the Michigan Program Network, because we started that work fairly early. So we've been actually going to the literature quite a bit and learning more about things like rehearsals, for example, and just how to think a little bit differently about setting up practice opportunities for our candidates. I mean, one of the ways that we talk about and think about this is similar to if you're, someone who orchestrates a band or is a coach of an athletic team. When band members are practicing a particular piece and you hear something that's off key or in the wrong note, the band director doesn't continue until the end of the piece and then provide feedback. There's a stop. The person stops, corrects the mistake, asks the musician to play it correctly, and then pick it up and continue on. And so rehearsals, the way we're thinking about rehearsals, are done in much the same way. We rarely ever give beginner teachers an opportunity to practice, to enact a particular practice, and stop them and give them in the moment feedback. Usually we're watching them or observing them in a whole classroom situation, and all of that feedback waits until the end. So this is just, I think it's similar to what James said when he was talking about other professions. This is just a particular pedagogical approach that's very similar to how other professions, other performers for that matter, operate when they are shoring up their skills. So those are the types of things that we're working on and learning ourselves. And we've had a lot of support from other institutions who are just a little bit ahead of us in this work. And so yeah, I think that's a great question. Is that maybe a next step is collecting some of the pedagogy and sharing that as well.
If I could answer that, Paula, there is a practice-based preparation in future ed.
James, sorry to interrupt you real quick. You're coming in really quiet. If you could get a little bit closer to your microphone, maybe. I'd love to hear what you have to say in response to this one, because I know you've been deeply involved in the teacher education portion of it.
Sorry about that. There is an issue brief on the CEEDAR website, Learning to Teach, Practice-Based Preparation in Teacher Education, that Amber Benedict, Mary Brownell, Lynn Hoheide, and Abby Foley did, that I think you'll find useful. There also is a related rubric. And both of those documents talk about the types of changes that need to occur to move toward a more practice-based approach to teacher preparation. So very practical and usable for teacher educators, and I think it's provide a good resource in response to that question.
Okay, so this one, we've got two questions kind of about this. For teacher certification testing and for teacher evaluation, do you guys see the HLPs being integrated with these in the future, and do you see the HLPs aligning with the current CEC standards? And James, is the chair of our Professional Standards and Practice Committee, I'm going to toss this one to you first.
Okay, two quick things about that. One, as far as assessments are concerned, there's some very interesting things that are going on. The Educational Testing Service is developing a set of avatar-based assessments that they're using to assess the general education HighLeverage practices that were developed by Deborah Ball. And I have talked with the person who's doing the developing as far as that's concerned, and it's very interesting. We're looking at special education in a similar way. So hopefully there will be some possibilities that there will be some high-quality, reliable, valid assessments that are interactive with avatars where candidates can demonstrate the use of practices. So there is some movement certainly in that direction. Regarding CEC standards, there is actually a group that's meeting in a few weeks for the first time at CEC headquarters that will begin to revise the preparation standards for CEC. Prior to that, there was a framing group that was pulled together, chaired by Linda Blanton and Julian Hoffman. And that group wrote a document that's available from CEC that describes the general parameters and framework for this revision. And there's a real emphasis throughout that document, which was approved by the CEC board, that we will focus on a more practice-based approach to teacher preparation standard. Now, it's kind of amusing, I guess, that I'm saying this in a way because Kate has already done this for us. If you look at what Kate's requiring now, they are certainly moving very much a practice-based direction as well. So all these things seem to be kind of coalescing at the same time, but it's good timing for CEC. Our standards are due to be completed in 2019. We don't think we will meet that deadline date, so we've asked for an extension beyond that. But hopefully by 2019, 2020, we'll have a new set of preparation standards, and then a couple of years after that, over 10 months.
So this is Deb. I'd like to address the question centered around the use of the HighLeverage practices in teacher evaluation. One of the future projects that we'll be working on in collaboration with the CEEDAR Center is developing a tool that will help administrators excuse me, look at these HighLeverage practices in relation to observing, providing feedback, evaluating, and providing professional development for teachers in the classroom. So that's a future initiative that we'll be working on in 2018.
Great.
This is
Sarah.
Sarah.
Go ahead.
That's okay. This is Sarah from Oregon, and just wanted to add that from the beginning, TSPC, and I mentioned that in Oregon, the Teacher Standards and Practices, or our certification agency, is not a part of the Department of Education and was involved in the development of our blueprint and some of the early work. They also have been involved in the approval of the modules that I mentioned. And so in terms of connecting with our certification and our work related to the high leverage practices and equity, they've been a part of our work.
Awesome, thank you guys. Okay, so next one, will we be doing anything with HLPs working with or for paraeducators? That's been something that's come up in a lot of departmental meetings.
The
Who wants to take that one first?
Well, I'll talk generally about it. The Professional Standards and Practice Committee has been considering how to improve preparation of paraeducators. So there are some issues we're addressing surrounding that, but HLPs have not come up to this point in time. We've all been so busy in developing these HLPs for special ed teachers, but I certainly think that's an excellent idea. There is a group within CEC that's very interested in addressing improving practice of paraeducators that the Professional Standards Group will be working with in the coming months, and that will certainly be a direction that comes up and will be discussed as a possibility for that group's work.
All right, so it doesn't look like there's any more questions at this time. We know we gave you guys a lot of information about how the HLPs are developed and being used and what's coming in the future. So keep an eye on HighLeveragePractices.org. That's where we'll be sharing a lot of the information that comes as our HLP work progresses. I'd like to thank our presenters this evening for their time and expertise and for the great work that they're doing in developing HLPs and their commitment to special education and gifted education. As a reminder, you guys will have access to a recording of this webinar in the all-member forum later this week. Please keep an eye out for that email. We'll also share links to some of the documents that were mentioned, the HLP site, and some other goodies in there as well. Thank you guys all for joining us and have a wonderful evening.